Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we are embarking on a journey not through the stars or the ancient myths of gods, but through the sensory, heavy, and opulent world of a man who lived as a god upon the earth. I want you to settle into your blankets, let the weight of the day lift from your shoulders, and imagine a world of flickering torchlight, the scent of roasting venison, and the distant, rhythmic chopping of 1,000 kitchen knives. Tonight, we explore the legendary appetite of King Henry VIII. As always, let me know where in the world you are listening from. Get cozy, find your stillness, and let us begin. In the beginning of the 16th century, the English court was not merely a place of politics, it was a theater of consumption. To understand what Henry ate is to understand how he ruled. For Henry, food was power. It was a language of dominance, a display of wealth so vast it could swallow the resources of an entire kingdom. When we think of Henry, we often see the titan of his later years, the broad-shouldered, barrel-chested king draped in ermine and gold. But that frame was built, layer by layer, dish by dish, over decades of royal excess. Imagine the palace of Hampton Court in the deep stillness before dawn. While the king slept in his great bed, draped in heavy silks to ward off the damp English chill, the kitchens were already a hive of heat and industry. This was the Great Kitchen, a cathedral of masonry and fire. Here, the air was never still. It hummed with the heat of 6 massive hearths, each large enough to roast a whole ox. The smell was a thick, intoxicating fog of wood smoke, rendered fat, and the sharp, medicinal tang of herbs, like hyssop and sage. Henry did not eat like a common man, nor did he eat at common hours. His first meal of the day, his breaking of fast, was a private affair, yet it carried the weight of ritual. As the morning light filtered through the leaded glass of his private chambers, the king would be presented with a selection that would stagger a modern table. There was no simple porridge or humble bread for the Tudor lion. Instead, there were manchet loaves, the finest, whitest wheaten bread, sifted so many times it was soft as a cloud and pale as bone. Beside the bread sat deep dishes of butter, churned fresh that morning, and heavy silver platters of meat. Henry's mornings often began with a pottage, thick, slow-simmered stewbit, not of vegetables alone. As the sun climbed higher over the Thames, the preparation for the main event, the dinner, began in earnest. In the Tudor world, dinner was served at 11 in the morning. It was the centerpiece of the day, a choreographed dance of hundreds of servants. Henry's kitchens were a city within a city, employing over 200 people whose sole purpose was to satisfy the royal palate. There were the cereers who oversaw the roasting, the larderers who managed the vast stores of salted meats, and the yeomen of the mouth who took the utmost care in tasting every morsel to ensure no poison touched the king's lips. The sheer scale of the ingredients moving into the palace was breathtaking. Every year, the king's household consumed over 1,200 oxen, 8,000 sheep, 2,300 deer, and 53,000 loaves of bread. This was not eating. This was an industrial-scale harvest. As you lie there, imagine the sound of the carts arriving. At the palace gates, the rattling of wooden wheels on cobblestones, the lowing of cattle, and the shouts of the purveyors bringing the bounty of the English countryside to the king's feet. Henry's love for meat was foundational. He was a man of the hunt, a king who spent his youth galloping through the green depths of Windsor Forest in pursuit of the red deer. To him, the stag was the ultimate prize. At the table, venison was the meat of kings. It was served in pasties, huge crusts of rye pastry that acted as natural pressure cookers, sealing in the juices and the wild, gamey aroma of the forest. When the crust was broken, a cloud of steam would rise, carrying with it the essence of the hunt itself. But Henry's palate was far more adventurous than simple beef and deer. The Tudor table was a place of biological curiosity. On a single afternoon, the king might be presented with roasted swan, its feathers sometimes painstakingly replaced after cooking, so it appeared to float upon a silver platter. There were peacocks, their iridescent tails fanned out in a display of macabre beauty. There were herons, shovelers, and even the tiny, delicate bodies of larks and sparrows, roasted until their bones were brittle and sweet. The flavors were not what we might expect. The Tudor tongue craved a balance of sweet and sour, a legacy of the medieval past. Meats were often cooked with fruitsville, with oranges, pork with prunes, or chicken smothered in a sauce of crushed grapes and verjuice. The air in the dining hall was a thick tapestry of these scents, the sharpness of vinegar clashing with the heavy floral sweetness of rosewater and honey. As Henry sat at the high table, the great hall would be filled with the sound of music and recorders playing softly from the minstrel's gallery to aid the king's digestion. For in the Tudor mind, the body was a vessel of humors that had to be kept in balance. Heavy meats were hot and moist, requiring the cool influence of certain wines or the dry texture of crusty bread to keep the king's temperament stable. Yet, as the years progressed, the balance tipped. The athletic prince who could dance all night and hunt all day began to vanish, replaced by a man whose body was a map of his excesses. The feasts grew longer, the dishes more complex, and the king's chair wider. But for now, in this early hour of our story, the king is still vibrant. The fire in the hearth is bright, the ale is cold, and the first course has only just been cleared. Close your eyes and listen to the distant clatter of the silver, the low murmur of the courtiers, and the crackle of the great oak logs. The world of the Tudors is vast and heavy, a world of velvet and iron, of sugar and salt. We are only just beginning to taste what it meant to be Henry. The sun hangs high over the lead-lined roofs of the palace, and the shadows in the great hall begin to shorten. The morning's light breaking of fast is now a distant memory, a mere sharpening of the royal appetite. Now the atmosphere shifts. The casual energy of the morning evaporates, replaced by a rigid, rhythmic solemnity. This is the hour of the midday feast, the true heart of the Tudor day. As you settle deeper into your pillow, imagine the heavy oak doors of the great hall swinging open. The air here is different, cooler than the kitchens, yet thick with the scent of fresh rushes strewn upon the floor. mingled with the expensive perfumes of 500 courtiers, and the mounting steam from the buttery. To eat with Henry was to participate in a grand culinary liturgy. This was not a meal where one simply sat and ate. It was a procession. The sewers and carvers moved with the precision of soldiers. Every dish brought to the king's table was covered with a neckerchief, a fine linen, to prevent dust or worse from tainting the food. The ritual of the assay was performed with hushed breath as officials tasted the sauces and the bread under the watchful eyes of the guard, a constant reminder that even in his most private moments of indulgence, the king was a target. The first course of the midday feast was designed to overwhelm. In the Tudor mind, a table should never show the wood it was built upon. It should be a landscape of silver, pewter, and gold. First came the grass chairs, the great meats. These were the foundations of the English identity. Massive joints of beef, boiled with succulent pieces of bacon, and flavored with lovage. Loins of veal, rubbed with butter and sage. And the great pie, a monumental construction of pastry that might contain an entire flock of different birds, seasoned with large quantities of pepper and cloves. As the king's nifa, personal jewel-encrusted tool, 4 forks were still a scandalous Italian curiosity, pierced the meat. The sheer variety of the animal kingdom began to unfold. Henry was a man of the water as much as the woods. On fish days, which occurred on Wednesdays, Fridays, Saturdays, and throughout the long fast of Lent, the king's table became an aquarium of the bizarre and the beautiful. While the common folk ate salted herring or dried stockfish, Henry's table groaned under the weight of fresh porpoise, often served with a piment sauce of honey and spices. He dined on royal sturgeon, legendary for its firm, white flesh, and on the elusive lamprey, ancient, ill-like creature, simmered in its own blood and wine, a dish so rich it was said to have killed kings of the past. But it is in the hidden dishes of the royal pantry that we see the true eccentricity of Henry's palate. He was obsessed with the fritters of spinach, small, deep-fried pockets of greens that were dusted with sugar and cinnamon, blurring the line between savory and sweet. He delighted in marmalade, not the orange spread we know, but a thick, solid paste of quince, molded into intricate shapes of lions and roses. There were leech jellies, made from isinglass and rosewater, layered in vibrant colors of red and white to mirror the Tudor rose. As you breathe slowly, imagine the taste of these things, the strange, cloying sweetness of meat paired with fruit, the heavy richness of the cream-based sops, and the constant, underlying hum of the spices. Spices were the gold of the kitchen. A single pound of nutmeg or ginger cost more than a laborer earned in a year. To Henry, using them in excess was a way of saying that he held the world's trade routes in the palm of his hand. His sauces were not mere accompaniments. They were thick, vibrant cane lines made of breadcrumbs, vinegar, and enough cinnamon to scent a whole wing of the palace. And then there was the sugar. To understand the king's eventual decline, one must understand his transition into a sugar sovereign. In the early years of his reign, sugar was a medicinal luxury, but as the 1520s turned into the 1530s, it became an addiction. The Tudors believed sugar was a neutral substance that could aid digestion, and so it was applied to everything. It was sprinkled on roasted rabbit. It was stirred into the king's wine. It was even used to preserve vegetables. The king's favorite indulgence was the subtlety. These were the masterpieces of the royal confectioners. Elaborate sculptures made entirely of sugar plate, a mixture of sugar, rosewater, and gum trees. At the end of a course, the servants might carry in a sugar-sculpted cathedral, a miniature fleet of ships, or a life-sized stag, all glistening and brittle. The king would break off a piece of a sugar castle-s turret, or a dragon-s wing, and let it melt on his tongue. It was a fleeting, expensive triumph. This constant intake of refined sugar, combined with the lack of fiber in the king's diet for vegetables, were largely seen as peasant food that engendered winds began to take its toll. The king's teeth, once white and strong, began to suffer the black rot that would eventually plague his daughter, Elizabeth. But in the moment of the feast, with the wine flowing and the laughter of his favorites like Charles Brandon or Thomas Wyatt echoing off the height-embered ceiling, the king felt invincible. He would wash down his sugar-dusted venison with ipocris, a potent medicinal wine strained through a manicum hippocraticum, a conical cloth filter, and heavily infused with long pepper, grains of paradise, and sugar. It was a drink designed to close the stomach and settle the humors, but in reality it was a liquid fire that kept the king's metabolism in a state of constant, agitated heat. As the second course arrived, the light meats were presented. These were the birds of the air pheasants, partridges, and the king's beloved cochintrice. A cochintrice was a marvel of Tudor culinary dark humor and skill, the front half of a piglet sewn to the back half of a capon, or vice versa, roasted as a single mythical beast. It was a dish designed to provoke wonder and conversation, a testament to the idea that at the king's table, the laws of nature could be rewritten. Imagine the king now, leaning back in his chair of estate. The velvet of his doublet is stretched tight. The air is heavy with the smell of ambergris, a waxy substance from the digestive system of sperm whales that was added to the king's most delicate dishes to give them an earthy, musky aroma. It is a scent that lingers in the back of the throat, ancient and deep. Outside the great hall, the broken meats, the leftovers from the king's table, were already being gathered. In a display of royal charity, these remains were distributed to the almoners to be given to the poor at the palace gates. The king's excess literally fed the village, a cycle of consumption that reinforced his role as the great provider. But inside, the king was looking toward the void. This was the final stage of the meal, where the tables were cleared, the voiding of the halt, to make room for the banquet. In the Tudor era, a banquet was not the meal itself, but a separate, private party centered entirely around sweets and wine, often held in a different room or even a small banqueting house in the gardens. As we prepare to follow the king into those private chambers in the next section, feel the weight of this midday indulgence, the thousands of calories, the richness of the cream, the sharp tangs of the wine, and the cloying persistence of the sugar. The king's body is a furnace, burning through the resources of England. The world is quiet now, the heavy afternoon sun dipping toward the horizon, and the king's breath is slow and deep, heavy with the spoils of his kingdom. Stay here in this golden Tudor afternoon. The sounds of the hall are fading. The clatter of silver is being replaced by the soft rustle of tapestry in the breeze. We are moving from the public spectacle of the feast to the private, darker cravings of the king's evening. The afternoon sun begins its slow descent, casting long, amber fingers of light. The heavy, formal atmosphere of the great hall begins to dissolve, replaced by something more intimate, yet no less opulent. In the Tudor world, the transition from the midday dinner to the evening banquet was a movement from the body to the solar, at least to the senses. As you pull your blankets closer, imagine leaving the cavernous echoes of the hall for the king's privy chambers. The air here is warmer, scented with expensive beeswax candles and the lingering smoke of dried lavender thrown onto the hearth. The banquet was the most misunderstood meal of Henry's day. To us, a banquet is a large feast, but to Henry, it was the post-dinner, a sophisticated course of sweets, spiced wines, and delicacies designed to delight the mind. Often, the king would retreat to a banqueting house, a small, jewel-like building set apart in the gardens, to escape the prying eyes of the broader court. Here, the food became art. In these private moments, Henry's obsession with fruit came to the fore. In the 16th century, raw fruit was viewed with deep suspicion by physicians, who believed it was cold and moist, capable of causing fevers or fluxes in the bowels. But Henry, ever the rebel against restriction, adored the bounty of his orchards. He was particularly fond of the warden's large, firm pears that were slow roasted in wine and honey until they turned a deep, translucent crimson. Imagine the texture of such a pear, soft enough to yield to a silver spoon, yet holding the structural integrity of the wood it grew upon, bleeding a syrupy reduction of cinnamon and cloves. There were also the cherries, grown in the royal orchards at Tainham in Kent, which the king would eat by the handful. To mitigate the coldness of the fruit, the royal cooks would often serve them in confit, preserved in thick sugar syrup that had been boiled to the crack stage, creating a brittle glass-like shell around the tart juice of the berry. The sound of the king biting into these sugared fruits was the sound of Tudor luxury, a sharp snap followed by a burst of summer sweetness. But the evening was also a time for the spicery to show its true power. The king's favorite evening snacks were comfits. These were seeds of anise, fennel, or caraway, were painstakingly coated in layer after layer of melted sugar. A single comfit could take days to produce, as each layer had to dry perfectly before the next was applied. These were kept in ornate gold comfit boxes and nibbled on throughout the night. They were the Tudor version of breath mints, intended to mask the heavy scent of the afternoon's venison and ale. But they also provided a constant, steady drip of glucose into the king's system. As the evening deepened into night, the void wine was brought forth. This was not the rough ale of the morning, but the clary, a white wine sweetened with honey and infused with an array of botanicals, ginger, long pepper, and grains of paradise. This spice, grains of paradise, was a favorite of Henry's, harvested in West Africa. It had a flavor that sat somewhere between black pepper, cardamom, and citrus. It gave the wine a bite that warmed the king's throat as he sat by the fire, perhaps listening to a lutenist play a melancholic air he himself had composed. However, as the years pressed on, the king's relationship with food began to change from one of pure pleasure to one of desperate necessity. By the late 1530s, the athletic king of the field, of the cloth of gold, was fading. His leg, injured in a jousting accident in 1536, had become a chronic, ulcerated wound that refused to heal. The pain was a constant, throbbing companion, and Henry sought solace in the only way he knew how, through the comfort of the palate. His late-night comfort foods became more frequent. In the quiet hours when the palace slept, the king would often call for all-night provisions. These were left in his bedchamber in case the royal appetite stirred in the darkness. He favored cream of almonds, a thick, velvety paste made from ground almonds, rosewater, and sugar. which was believed to be restorative for a tired body. It was a soft, pale food, easy to swallow and deeply calming, a stark contrast to the aggressive meats of the day. He also turned increasingly to jellies of flesh. These were not the sweet fruit jellies we know today, but highly concentrated broths made from calves' feet and chicken carcasses, boiled down until they were packed with collagen, and then cooled into a clear, wobbling solid. They were flavored with saffron to give them a golden hue and served cold. To a man with a feverish leg and a restless mind, these jellies were a soothing, cooling balm for the internal heat of his illness. Yet the king's doctors were worried. They began to suggest a dietary regimen to manage his mounting weight and the humors of his leg. They urged him to eat lighter birds like the gull or the puffin, which, curiously, the church classified as fish because they lived near the sea, allowing them to be eaten on fast days. They encouraged the consumption of Sakate citrus peel that had been boiled in sugar to provide cleansing properties. Henry, however, was a difficult patient. He would follow the doctor's orders for a day, perhaps dining on a simple poached pike with a touch of vinegar, only to succumb the next evening to a pasty of red deer or a tart of strawberries, so large it required 2 servants to carry. His body had become a battlefield where his indomitable will fought against his failing biology. Imagine the king in these later years, sitting in his private cabinet. The room is draped in heavy tapestries depicting the hunts of his youth. He looks at his hands once capable of bending a longbow, now softened and adorned with rings that bite into the flesh. On the table before him sits a dish of quince paste. He takes a silver knife and carves a small square. The quince is dense, fragrant, and sharp. It is the taste of his kingdom, beautiful, complex, but perhaps a little too heavy to bear. The sounds of the palace at night are a symphony of wood and wind. The creak of the floorboards as the guards pace the galleries, the hoot of an owl from the great park, the crackle of a dying ember in the grate. Henry's world is shrinking. It is no longer the vast expanse of France or the political landscape of Rome. It is the distance between his chair and the next tray of comfits. In this section of our journey, we see the king not as a tyrant, but as a man seeking comfort in the familiar. The spices that once represented global power now represent a way to settle a sour stomach. The sugar that once represented wealth now represents a fleeting escape from the pain in his leg. As you drift toward sleep, think of the king's evening as a slow, golden fade. The lanterns are being dimmed. The last of the ipecris has been drained. The yeoman of the bedchamber is drawing the heavy curtains, sealing the king into a world of silk and silence. But even in the dark, the kitchens never truly sleep. Somewhere in the bowels of the palace, a pot of beef pottage is already being set to simmer for the morning. The cycle of consumption is eternal, and the king's appetite remains the sun around which the entire Tudor world orbits. Sleep now, and let the scent of cinnamon and woodsmoke carry you back to a time when a meal was a monument, and a king's hunger could move the world. We have explored the feast and the private cravings. In our next section, we will look at the chemistry of the kitchens. How these incredible meals were actually constructed from the raw elements of the earth. In the Tudor mind, water was a dangerous, treacherous, elemental cold substance that brought on the ague, chilled the humors, and carried the invisible seeds of the sweating sickness. For a king, water was for washing the hands in rose-scented basins, or for filling the palace moats. But it was rarely, if ever, for drinking. This was a liquid kingdom. The sheer volume of alcohol consumed at Henry's court is staggering to the modern mind. On an average day, the royal household consumed approximately 600 gallons of ale. This was the small ale, a beverage so central to life that it was issued as part of the daily wages for everyone from the highest duke to the lowliest laundry-maid. It was the daily bread in liquid form, thick, cloudy, and packed with B vitamins and calories. But these were not the aged, refined vintages we know today. Imagine the buttery, where the king's cupbearer prepared the royal draught. As the evening wore on, the king would transition to a peckress, the most prestigious drink of the age. Hops acted as a preservative, allowing the drink to last longer and travel further. At first, many in England, including the king, viewed hops as a wicked weed that would spoil the national character. But as Henry's reign progressed, the practicality of beer won out. It was cleaner, crisper, and less likely to sour in the summer heat. By the end of his life, the king's breweries were producing thousands of barrels of hopped beer to fuel his navy and his ever-expanding court. The ritual of drinking was as choreographed as the feast itself. The king never poured his own drink. His wine was brought to him in a covered cup of solid gold. The cupbearer would drop to one knee, uncover the cup, and perform the assay, drinking a small amount himself to prove it was free of poison. Only then would Henry take the vessel. The gold would be cool against his fingers, but the liquid inside was a fire that burned through the exhaustion of statecraft. In this liquid world, drunkenness was viewed differently than it is today. To be merry was expected, but to lose control was a breach of the great chain of being. Yet, with the constant intake of ale and wine from dawn until midnight, the entire Tudor court lived in a state of perpetual, mild intoxication. It made the long hours of standing in the presence of the king bearable. It turned the cold, draughty stone corridors of the palace into places of warmth and camaraderie. However, this constant consumption of alcohol had a profound effect on the king's health. The Malmsey and Muscatel wines he adored were incredibly high in sugar. Imagine the king's cellarer now, deep in the shadows of the palace. He moves between the casks with a flickering candle, checking the seals, tasting the air for the telltale sharp scent of spoilage. He knows that a sour barrel could mean the king's wrath, while a perfect vintage could mean a royal favor. The economy of the palace was an economy of the vine and the grain. Outside, the Thames River flowed, the very lifeblood of London. But for the inhabitants of the palace, the river was merely a highway for boats and a source of fish. They looked at the water and saw danger. They looked at the wine and saw life. It was a culture that feared the natural and celebrated the manufactured. As you drift toward sleep, imagine the sound of the wine being poured into a golden goblet, a heavy, viscous sound, like silk sliding over stone, the clink of the lid closing, the soft murmur of the cupbearer, and the king's deep sigh of satisfaction. The liquid kingdom is a world of warmth, of spice, and of a deep, fermented peace. The king's thirst is a constant, a fire that must be fed. And as long as the wine flows from France, and the ale is brewed in the palace yards, the Tudor sun will never set. Sleep now, in this world of amber and gold, where the water is forgotten and the wine is the only truth. We have tasted the meat and the drink. In our next section, we will explore the seasonal cycle, how the changing of the leaves and the coming of the frost transformed the king's table from a summer garden to a winter fortress. The seasons of the Tudor world did not just change the weather, they changed the very soul of the kitchen. In the 16th century, the king's table was a mirror of the earth's cycle, governed by the strict laws of the church and the natural bounty of the English soil. As you settle into the quiet of the evening, imagine the palace of Hampton Court transforming as the first frost bites into the ground. The light outside turns a pale, brittle blue, and the great oak logs are piled higher in the hearths. This was the time of the great winter, a season of extremes, where the king moved from the deepest restrictions of the soul to the most flamboyant excesses of the flesh. To understand the Tudor year is to understand the tension between the feast and the fast. For nearly a third of the year, the king was forbidden by religious law from touching meat. This was not a suggestion, it was a spiritual mandate. During Lent, the 40 days leading up to Easter, the massive roasting spits in the great kitchen stood silent. The scent of browning beef and venison vanished, replaced by the sharp, briny aroma of the sea. As you breathe in the cool air of your room, imagine the shift in the palace atmosphere, the boisterous energy of the hunt replaced by a somber, rhythmic piety. But even in the depths of Lenten restriction, Henry's table was a place of luxury. If he could not eat meat, he would eat the finest meat of the sea. The king's fish days were a spectacle of biological variety. There were huge platters of salted ling, stockfish beaten with hammers until tender, and the king's favorite, fresh sturgeon, a royal fish that by law belonged to the monarch whenever it was caught in English waters, because dairy butter, milk, and eggs was also forbidden during the strictest fasts. The royal cooks turned to their most versatile alchemical tool, the almond. Almond milk was the lifeblood of the Lenten kitchen. It was used to thicken soups, to create creamy fustier, a kind of Lenten custard, and to craft faux butter that looked and tasted remarkably like the real thing. To Henry, Lent was not just a time of penance. It was a challenge to his cooks to prove that even in scarcity, the king could live like a god. But as the winter deepened and the Star of Bethlehem rose in the Tudor mind, the restrictions of Lent were a distant memory, and the 12 days of Christmas began. This was the zenith of the king's appetite. If the rest of the year was a mountain of food, Christmas was the summit. The centerpiece of the Tudor Christmas was the boar's head. Imagine the great hall filled with the sound of trumpets and the boar's head carol, the head of a wild forest boar, tusks gleaming and eyes replaced with polished fruit or jewels, was carried aloft on a silver platter. It was garnished with rosemary and bay, a symbol of the king's mastery over the wild. This was not just a dish, it was a totem. To eat the boar was to consume the strength of the forest itself. Then came the Christmas pie. This was a legendary construction, even by Henry's standards. It was a coffin of pastry that contained a turkey, which had been stuffed with a goose, which had been stuffed with a chicken, which had been stuffed with a partridge, which had been stuffed with a pigeon. This nesting doll of poultry was seasoned with massive amounts of mace, nutmeg, and the king's beloved saffron. It was a dish of pure, unadulterated power. To carve into it was to reveal the layers of the king's dominion over the avian world. During these 12 days, the Lord of Misrule reigned over the court, a servant, appointed to mock the king and lead the revelry. The food followed this spirit of misrule. There were wasps' nests, sweet pastries filled with honey and nuts, and the 12th night cake, which contained a hidden bean. Whoever found the bean became the king of the bean for the night, a fleeting reversal of the social order that Henry tolerated with a booming, ale-soaked laugh. But the most iconic flavor of the Tudor Christmas was the mince pie. These were not the small, sweet fruit tarts we know today. A Tudor mince pie was a shrid pie, a dense, savory sweet mixture of shredded mutton or beef, suet, dried raisins, prunes, and a heavy hand of Christmas spices. The meat and fruit were preserved together by the high sugar and alcohol content, creating a flavor that was ancient, rich, and deeply festive. The scent of these pies baking in the great ovens was the very smell of the holiday, a warm, spicy fog that drifted through every corridor of the palace. As the Christmas fire roared, the king would call for syllabub, a frothy, decadent drink made by milking a cow directly into a bowl of sweetened cider or wine. The acid in the alcohol caused the milk to curdle into a soft, cloud-like foam on top, while the liquid remained sharp and cold below. It was a textural wonder, a drink that was both a food and a beverage, embodying the Tudor love for the in-between. However, as the 12 days ended and the Plough Monday signaled the return to work, the king's body often paid the price for this midwinter madness. The transition from the heavy, fat-rich meats of Christmas to the sudden coldness of the Lenten fish was a shock to the system. It was often in the early spring that the king's health would falter, his humors thrown into chaos by the violent swings of his diet. Imagine the king now, as the Christmas decorations of holly and ivy are taken down and burned. He sits in his chair, the warmth of the fire at his front, and the chill of the stone at his back. He is full perhaps, to full. The memory of the boar's head and the spiced wine lingers in his throat, but the shadow of the coming Lent is already stretching across the floor. The seasonal cycle was more than just a menu. It was the pulse of the kingdom. It reminded everyone, from the king to the kitchen boy, that they were bound by the laws of God and the rhythms of the earth. Even the most powerful man in England had to bow to the calendar. As you drift closer to sleep, think of the palace as a great clock, its gears turned not by metal but by the arrival of the salmon in the spring, the ripening of the cherries in the summer, the slaughter of the hogs in the autumn, and the roasting of the boar in the winter. The world is in order. The king has feasted, and now he must wait. Listen to the wind whistling through the chimney stacks of Hampton Court. It carries the scent of the dying Christmas fires and the faint, salty promise of the Lenten fish to come. The year turns, the king eats, and the history of England is written in the grease upon the platter and the wine within the cup. Sleep now, and in our next section, we will travel with the king on his great progresses, leaving the palaces behind to see what Henry ate when he took his appetite into the wild heart of the English countryside. As you settle into your bed, imagine the sound of 300 ox carts rumbling over dry dirt roads, the jingling of silver harnesses, A royal progress was not a vacation. It was an act of political theater. Henry traveled to the estates of his most powerful nobles, staying in their manor houses for weeks at a time. For the host, a royal visit was both a supreme honor and a looming financial catastrophe. To host the king was to be responsible for his table, and Henry's table did not shrink when he left his palaces. This was the season of Greece, when the deer were at their fattest and most succulent. After a morning of riding, the gathering would take place in a shaded glade. The flavor was wild, bright, iron-rich, and intensified by the smoke of the oak and hawthorn. At Cowdray House or Kenilworth, The king was presented with the wonders of the local earth. If he were near the coast, there would be seaside banquets featuring lobsters the size of a man's forearm, crabs simmered in heavy cream and mace, and puffins from the rocks, which were considered a great delicacy. If he were in the marshlands of East Anglia, the table would be heavy with wild fowl of the fens, bitterns knots. These were the royal officials who rode ahead of the king to seize supplies from local markets. By royal prerogative, the king had the right to buy food at prices set by his own menafand, much lower than the market rate. A royal progress could leave a trail of empty barns and disgruntled farmers in its wake. Thousands of chickens, hundreds of sheep, and every drop of ale in a 10-mile radius would be funneled toward the king's temporary kitchen. As the sun sets on the progress, imagine the king sitting on a makeshift throne in a provincial great hall. The air is different. Here it's fresher than the stagnant air of London, carrying the scent of mown hay and wood ash. But the ritual remains the same. The assay is performed, the gold cup is raised, and the king eats. Here, in the wild, his appetite seems even larger. His diet on these later progresses became a strange mix of the rustic and the medicinal. He would crave the simple, heavy pottages of the countryside, believing the local beef had more virtue than the refined meats of the city. Yet he remained tethered to his bags of expensive imported spices and his barrels of sweet, heavy wine. Think of the king now, resting in a strange bed in a noble's house. To eat the produce of a distant county was to digest that land, to make it part of his own physical being. As you fall into a deeper sleep, imagine the long line of carts and horses winding through the golden twilight of a Tudor July. the king is moving. The fires are burning in a dozen different manners, and the feast goes on, forever traveling, forever hungry. Listen to the rhythmic thud of the horse's hooves on the summer earth. As the night deepens and the palace of Hampton Court breathes with the weight of its own history, the flickering candlelight casts long, dancing shadows against the stone walls. In the previous sections, we explored the king's indulgence, his vast appetite, and the sensory delights of his table. But tonight, as you settle into the soft embrace of your pillows, we must look at the darker companion that sat beside Henry at every meal: fear. To be a king in the 16th century was to live in a state of constant, quiet vigilance. Every silver platter of venison, every gilded goblet of spiced wine, and every sugared delicacy was a potential vessel for death. In the Tudor mind, the feast was a battlefield, and the mouth was the most vulnerable gate of the fortress. Imagine the tension in the air as the sewer approached the king's table. This was not a man who cleared drains, but a high-ranking official responsible for the seating and serving. He did not simply place a dish before Henry. He performed the liturgy of the assay. This was the sacred ritual of tasting, a choreographed dance designed to prove that the king's food was as pure as his divine right to rule. As you breathe slowly and feel the safety of your own surroundings, imagine the silence that would fall over the great hall as the taster stepped forward. The assay was a multi-layered defense system. First, there was the assay by sight. The taster would examine the dish for any unusual discoloration, strange textures, or the telltale oily sheen that certain toxins might leave behind. Then came the assay by smell, a deep inhalation to detect the bitter almond scent of arsenic or the metallic temps of lead. Finally, and most dramatically, came the assay by mouth. The taster would take a small portion of the food, place it upon a piece of manchet bread, and eat it in full view of the king and the court. He would then wait. A heavy, pregnant pause would follow, as the taster watched for any signs of distress in his own body. Only after a safe interval would the king reach for his knife. But the Tudors did not rely on human biology alone. They lived in an age where science and magic were inextricably linked, and the king's table was protected by alchemical guardians. One of the most prized possessions in the royal buttery was the long day serpents, or the serpent's tongue tree. This was an ornamental stand made of gold or silver, from which hung what the Tudors believed were the fossilized tongues of dragons or serpents. In reality, these were the fossilized teeth of ancient sharks, but to Henry, they were magical detectors. It was believed that if a tongue were dipped into a poisoned drink, it would sweat, change color, or even begin to tremble. There was also the unicorn's horn. Henry possessed several of these legendary objects. Actually, the tusks of narwhals, which were valued more highly than their weight in diamonds. A fragment of unicorn horn was often ground into a fine powder and stirred into the king's wine or pressed against his food. It was thought to be the ultimate universal antidote, capable of neutralizing any venom or corruption. As you lie there, imagine the king watching a white, spiraled horn being dipped into his wine, the torchlight catching the ripples in the liquid as he sought the reassurance of the supernatural. The fear of poison extended even to the vessels themselves. Henry's cup of assay was often made of agate or antimony, materials believed to have natural purifying properties. There was a belief that a cup made of true Venetian glass would shatter instantly if a poisoned liquid were poured into it. This transformation of the table into a laboratory of detection created a strange atmosphere of opulent paranoia. The king was surrounded by the finest things in the world, yet he could never truly relax. Every bite was a gamble. Every swallow was an act of faith. This paranoia dictated the geography of the kitchen. The yeomen of the mouth were the only people allowed to touch the king's personal portions. They were sworn to a life of purity, forbidden from visiting suspicious places or associating with lewd persons who might bribe them to slip a powder into the king's pottage. The king's food was prepared in a separate, smaller kitchen, away from the chaos of the Great Kitchen, under a watch that never blinked. When the food traveled from the kitchen to the king's chamber, it was escorted by a guard of the body, their poleaxes gleaming in the corridors, ensuring that no one could approach the tray. Even the salt cellar, the magnificent centerpiece of the table, had a protective function. The salt was often covered by a lid, and the official in charge of it would assay the salt by dipping a piece of bread into it and eating it before the king. Why? Because salt, being white and crystalline, was the perfect hiding place for powdered poisons. To take a grain of salt with Henry was to participate in a ritual of life and death. As Henry aged and his list of enemies grew from the disgruntled nobility at home to the powerful agents of Rome and the French court, this fear only intensified. His late-night comfort foods were subject to the same scrutiny. Even the almond milk brought to his bedside in the dead of night had to be tasted by a gentleman of the privy chamber. Imagine the king lying in his massive bed, the shadows of the bed curtains looming like giants, watching a trusted servant sip from his bowl before he dared to take a spoonful. Yet, there is a historical irony in this obsession with poison. While Henry spent a fortune on unicorn horns and tasters to avoid a sudden death by an assassin's hand, he was unknowingly poisoning himself every day. The slow poison was not arsenic or hemlock. It was the very diet we have been exploring. The lack of fiber, the extreme intake of refined sugar, the heavy lead content in the glazes of the pewter plates, and the chronic consumption of alcohol were the true assassins. The black rot in his teeth, the sourness in his stomach, and the corruption in his leg were the results of a lifestyle that no taster could protect him from. The Tudor science of safety was a shield against the sword, but it had no defense against the spoon. As the palace clock strikes the hour, and the guards change their watch in the courtyard below, think of the silence in the king's dining room once the meal is over. The assay has been successful. The king is still breathing. The serpent's tongues remain still. The fear has been pushed back for another few hours, held at bay by ritual and gold. But the fear never truly left. It lived in the buttery, it lurked in the spicery, and it sat at the king's right hand. It made every meal a performance and every taste a triumph of survival. Listen to the stillness of your own room. Here, there is no need for tasters or magical horns. You are safe in the modern world, far from the opulent paranoia of the Tudor court. Let the weight of the king's golden vessels fade from your mind. The assay is finished. The king is asleep, and the feast of fear is over. Sleep now, and in our next section, we will look at the physical legacy of this diet, how the king's body transformed from the rose of England to the colossus of gout, and the desperate, strange medical recipes he turned to in his final years to try and save himself from the consequences of his own appetite. The torchlight in the king's private gallery flickers low, casting long, distorted shadows that seem to groan against the stone. We have traveled through the grand halls, the bustling kitchens, and the spice-scented banqueting houses, but tonight, as you settle into the stillness of your own room, to understand the final years of Henry VIII is to witness the physical cost of a kingdom's excess. The legendary Tudor stomach was now a site of chronic inflammation. The ulcerated wounds, likely a result of chronic scurvy and type 2 diabetes diseases, born from a lack of fresh vegetables and a surfeit of sugar, had turned into fistulas that drained his strength. In the Tudor medical mind, this was not a matter of infection or insulin. It was a corruption of the humors. His physicians, desperate to balance his choleric and phlegmatic humors, prescribed a diet of alchemical restoration. And leaf gold, beaten so thin it floated like sunlight on the surface of the fat. The Tudors believed that because gold was incorruptible and pearls were pure, their virtue would pass into the king's blood, making his flesh as resilient as the treasures in his vault. It was a desperate attempt to use wealth to buy health. But the king's cravings often overrode his doctor's warnings, even as his legs were being cauterized with hot irons to stem the infection. He would call for maids of honor, small, sweet puff pastry tarts filled with lemon curd and cheese-or-matched loaves soaked in heavy, sweetened cream. He was a man trapped in a cycle of sweet and pain, using the piqueur sugar that was killing him to soothe the agony of the treatments meant to save him. The king's medical menu became increasingly strange. He was fed hedgehog broth, believed to be a potent remedy for falling sickness and kidney stones. He consumed water of strawberries, not as a refreshment, but as a cooling agent for his feverish liver. His bread was now often ardos, a medicinal loaf baked with ground coral and ivory shavings. To the modern ear, this sounds like madness, but to Henry, it was the ultimate diet of sovereignty. If the earth's most precious minerals could not save him, what could? Yet, the physical reality of his size had become a logistical crisis for the palace. It is estimated that by his final years, Henry weighed nearly 400 pounds, about 180 kilograms, with a waist measurement of 54 inches. He could no longer climb the stairs to his private apartments. The sound of the chains rattling and the wooden platform creaking under the weight of the monarch was the sound of a king who had outgrown his world. When he went to the gardens, he had to be pushed in a wheeled chair, a luxury of velvet and oak. On his lap there would always be a bowl of preserved cherries or candied ginger. The ginger was intended to expel the winds that plagued his bloated abdomen, but the sugar in which it was preserved only fueled the fire in his veins. There is a profound sadness in the solitary feast of the elderly Henry. In his youth, he ate at the center of a roaring crowd of courtiers. Now, he often ate in the privy chamber, surrounded only by a few trusted groom of the stool and his physicians. The grandeur of the gulp had been replaced by the silence of the swallow. The sounds of the meal were no longer laughter and music, but the heavy, labored breathing of a man whose heart was struggling to pump blood through a body transformed by decades of roasted meat and Malmsey wine. As the night wind rattles the window panes of the palace, think of the contrast of the kingdom. While Henry was being fed ground pearls and gilded capons, the average English peasant was living on maslin bread, a gritty mix of rye and wheat-hand white meats, which was the Tudor term for milk, butter, and cheese. The king was the most well-fed man in a world that often lived on the edge of hunger, yet he was perhaps the most physically miserable. His doctors tried one final dietary shift, the liquid retreat. He would brush aside the clear broths and demand venison pasties and roast cygnet young swan. He chose to die as he had lived, as a consumer of the world's greatest prizes. Imagine the king's final dinner. The room is dim. The scent of antiseptic herbs, like rosemary and rue, hangs heavy in the air to mask the smell of his failing legs. A silver tray is brought in. On it sits a small, perfectly roasted bird and a goblet of ypericris, dark and spiced. He takes a sip. The wine is warm, the spices familiar. Listen to the rhythmic, heavy thumping of the king's pulse in the silence of the room. It is a slow, tired beat. The royal alchemy has failed. The gold and the pearls did not mend the flesh, but the appetite that great Tudor hung remained until the very end. Sleep now, and let the image of the gilded king fade. We'll step away from the king's person and look at the global pantry. How Henry's hunger changed. The evening air grows stiller now, the heavy scent of the palace's history drifting like smoke through the corridors of time. We have seen the king in his glory and in his decline, but tonight, as you settle deeper into the warmth of your covers, we must look beyond the stone walls of England. To understand Henry VIII's table is to understand a world that was suddenly, violently expanding. While the king sat in his great hall, ships were crossing the sea of darkness, returning with treasures that would forever alter the way humanity eats. This was the birth of the global pantry. As your mind drifts, imagine the creaking of wooden hulls and the snap of canvas sails as the first New World wonders arrived at the London docks, destined for the royal mouth. In the early 1500s, an English dinner was a local affair governed by the soil of Europe. But by the middle of Henry's reign, the discovery of the Americas began to leak into the kitchen. The most dramatic arrival was the turkey. Imagine the king's surprise when he first laid eyes on this strange feathered beast of the Aztecs. In 1526, William Strickland brought the first 6 turkeys to England. They were not the centerpiece of a family holiday yet. They were exotic trophies. To Henry, the turkey was a marvel of meaty architecture. It was larger than a pheasant, richer than a peacock, and it carried the flavor of a distant, mysterious horizon. He had them served at court as a symbol of his rechief. A bird lived at the edge of the world. It would eventually find its way to Henry's platter. But not everything from the New World was greeted with such enthusiasm. It is a strange quirk of history that the foods that define our modern lives, the potato and the tomato, were largely ignored or even feared by the Tudor court. The potato, arriving from the Andes, was viewed with deep suspicion. Because it grew underground, it was seen as lowly and unclean, a food for pigs or the desperate. There were even rumors that it caused leprosy because of its gnarled, tuberous skin. Henry, who obsessed over the chain of being, would not have allowed such a dirty root to grace his high table. And then there was the love apple, the tomato, to the Tudors. The bright red fruit of the tomato vine was a poisonous beauty. They recognized it as a member of the nightshade family, the same family as the deadly belladonna. While Henry might have admired them in a garden as a curiosity, he would never have dreamed of making a sauce from them. Imagine a world where the King of England had never tasted a tomato or a potato. His abundance was vast, yet in some ways it was more limited than the simplest modern pantry. However, there was one New World treasure that Henry embraced with a passion that bordered on obsession: the ananas, or the pineapple. When the first pineapples were brought from the Caribbean, they were the ultimate status symbol. They were the king of fruits, crowned with a natural coronet of leaves. Because they often rotted during the long voyage, a fresh pineapple at a Tudor banquet was worth more than its weight in gold. Henry would have one placed at the center of his table, not necessarily to eat immediately, but to be witnessed. It was a botanical crown, a testament that the king's influence stretched across the Atlantic. When he did finally taste it, the sharp, acidic sweetness exploding on a tongue used to heavy honey and ale it must have felt like a revelation of a new era. But the global pantry wasn't just about the New World. It was about the reinvention of the East. Henry's reign saw the solidification of the spice roots. The pepper, cinnamon, and nutmeg that had once been rare medicinal curiosities were now flowing into London in greater quantities. This is where we see the Tudor spice war. To Henry, a dish wasn't finished until it was gilded with spices. He used them with a heavy hand to mask the scent of meat that had traveled too far, but also to warm his constitution. The grains of paradise from the pepper coast of Africa and the cloves of the Moluccas were the aromatic armor of his diet. Imagine the spicery at Hampton Court. It was a room that smelled like a dream of the Orient. There were massive mortar and pestles, the size of church bells, grinding the hard seeds of the East into a fine, fragrant dust. The clerk of the spicery kept the keys to the spice chests around his neck. For a single spilled bag of peppercorns was a month's wages lost. This dust was sprinkled over the king's roasted porpoise, stirred into his morning ale, and kneaded into his midnight manchet bread. And we cannot forget the Mediterranean influence. Henry's wives, particularly Catherine of Aragon, brought the flavors of Spain to the English court. Suddenly, bitter oranges from Seville and lemons of the south were appearing in the king's salads. These were used to make zests and citronades, providing a sharp, acidic counterpoint to the heavy fats of the English kitchen. It was the beginning of the English palate, moving away from the purely savory toward the zesty and bright. As you lie there, feeling the quiet of the night, think of the king's table as a map of the world. Every meal was a geographical survey. A single course might contain beef from the English plains, sugar from the Mediterranean islands, spices from the Indian Ocean, and a turkey from the forests of the Americas. Henry was consuming the globe. His stomach was the destination for the world's most dangerous and expensive voyages. This global hunger had a darker side. The demand for sugar and spices would soon lead to the age of exploration turning into the age of exploitation. The very subtleties and confections the king enjoyed were the early drivers of a global system that would change the fate of millions. But for Henry, sitting in the flicker of his torchlight, these were simply the fruits of God's favor. He saw no conflict in his appetite. He only saw the world's duty to feed him. Listen to the distant, imagined sound of the docks, the shouting of sailors, the rolling of barrels, the scent of brine and exotic woods. The world is getting smaller, and the king's plate is getting fuller. The new world has arrived, and it tastes like turkey and pineapple, seasoned with the ancient heat of the East. Sleep now, in this world of shifting horizons and expanding tastes. The king has tasted the king of fruits, and the map of England has been redrawn in the kitchen. In our next section, we will look at the legacy of the table, how the way Henry VIII ate created the British identity of food, from the Sunday roast to the national sweet tooth, and how his legendary appetite still haunts our kitchens today. The candles have burned down to their silver sockets, and the great logs in the hearth have collapsed into a soft, glowing bed of white ash. We have followed the king from the dawn of his reign through the steaming chaos of the great kitchens, across the green fields of the progress, and into the shadowy, medicinal silence of his decline. Now, as you reach the deepest, most peaceful part of your evening, we come to the final chapter of the king's appetite. In January of 1547, the Palace of Whitehall was gripped by a heavy, expectant stillness. The Tudor lion was failing. The man whose hunger had redefined a kingdom was finally facing a void that no amount of venison or spiced wine could fill. As you let your breath slow to a rhythmic, effortless pace, imagine the final curtains being drawn around the great bed of Henry VIII. The Last Supper of a king is rarely a grand affair of state. It is a quiet, desperate struggle of the senses. In those final days, the heavy, opulent dishes of his youth, the roasted swans, the cockatrice, the gilded boars, were no longer possible. The king's doctors, now more like priests of a failing temple, tried to coax a few more hours of life from his body with distilled waters of herbs and jellies of capon. Imagine the tiny silver spoon, once used to scoop out the marrow of great beasts, now carrying only a few drops of rosewater and honey to his parched lips. Yet, even at the very end, the king's mind was a map of his feasts. It is said that in his delirium he did not call for his crown or his counselors, but for the things that had brought him comfort. He whispered of the hunt, of the smell of the forest after a summer rain, and the taste of the red deer cooked over an open fire. His appetite had been the engine of his life, and as the engine slowed, the memories of flavor were the last things to fade. He was a man who had swallowed the church, digested the lands of the monasteries, and consumed the lives of those around him. Now he was being consumed by time itself. On the night of January 28th, the void finally arrived. But this was not the void of the banquet, the clearing of the tables to make room for sweets. This was the final clearing of the hall. When Henry breathed his last, the great kitchens of England fell into a momentary, shocked silence. For 38 years, the entire machinery of the English countryside had been geared toward satisfying this one man's hunger. Thousands of oxen, tens of thousands of sheep, rivers of ale, and mountains of sugar had flowed toward him. With his passing, a tectonic shift occurred in the English soul. The feast of Henry was over, but the hunger of England was just beginning. As you lie in the stillness, think of the culinary ghost the king left behind. When they opened his stores after his death, they found a fortune in spicery chests of ginger, cloves, and saffron that could have bought a small city. They found cellars filled with the wines of Gascony and Epicris that would never be drunk. This was the material legacy of a man who lived as if he would never stop consuming. But the true ghost was not in the pantry. It was in the national palate. The king's death marked the end of the medieval appetite and the birth of the modern diet. He had introduced the world to the idea of the global table. Because of him, the English would forever look toward the horizon for their flavors, to the sugar of the West and the spices of the East. He had turned the simple act of eating into a display of empire. As the centuries rolled on, the Sunday roast he championed would travel to the corners of the globe, and the British sweet tooth would change the agricultural landscape of entire continents. Henry's stomach was the crucible in which the modern world was stirred. But let us return to the palace one last time as the morning sun of a new reign begins to touch the rooftops. The children of the kitchen are waking up. They begin to sweep the floors, unaware that the king they served is gone. The yeomen of the guard are changing the watch. There is a sense of the great cycle continuing. The king is dead, but the earth is still fertile. The wheat is growing in the fields. The deer are moving through the forests, and the fish are swimming in the cold, gray waters of the channel. The hunger of the world does not die with a king. It simply finds a new vessel. As you drift into the deepest sleep, feel the peace of the cycle. We are all part of this grand consuming dance. We eat, we are fed, and eventually we return to the earth to feed the things that come after us. Henry VIII was a man who tried to stand above this cycle, to dominate it with his wealth and his will. But in the end, he was just a man, bound by the same humors and hungers as the rest of us. His story is a reminder of the beauty and the danger of excess, of the way food can be both a medicine and a poison, a crown and a cage. The sound of the Tudor world is fading now. The clatter of the pewter, the roar of the roasting fires, the shouting of the carvers, and the sweet, melodic strain of the lute solo of it is dissolving into the mists of history. What remains is the silence of the stones and the steady, enduring pulse of the land. You are safe, you are at rest. The assay of the day is finished, and the great banquet of your dreams is about to begin. Imagine yourself walking through the knot garden at Hampton Court in the early morning. The air is cool and smells of damp earth and lavender. There is no fear here, no poison, no great engine to haul you up, no gout to heavy your step. You are light, you are free, and the world is quiet. The king is at peace, and so are you. The history of the table is a story of union, the union of the earth's gifts with the human spirit. Henry VIII played his part with a roar and a flourish, leaving a trail of sugar and bone behind him. But tonight, that story is closed. The book is resting on the nightstand. The candle is out. Sleep now, child of the modern world, and let the Tudor lions sleep as well. The feasts are over, the wine is drained, and the hall is still. The stars are bright over the Thames, just as they were 500 years ago, and the world turns on, forever hungry, forever fed, forever at peace.